May 1945. The guns of Europe fell silent. Germany had surrendered. Across the continent, for millions, this was the hour of liberation. A triumphant chorus of church bells, a sea of fluttering flags, the long, dark shadow of war finally lifting. But for one group, a small, forgotten contingent of young German women, the end of the war did not mean freedom. It meant captivity. They had been the auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, secretaries who typed orders that sent men to their fates, radio operators who decoded messages in the static-filled night, nurses who bound wounds in field hospitals reeking of antiseptic and blood. Some had guided the beams of anti-aircraft searchlights, their faces illuminated in the cold glare, scanning the hostile skies. Others had manned switchboards in the depths of reinforced bunkers, their voices calm conduits in the chaos of a crumbling empire. They had not carried rifles or fired mortars, but they had been the cogs, the essential, unglamorous gears in the vast, grinding machine of the Reich. Now, with the Reich reduced to smoldering ash and shattered promises, they were rounded up. In railway yards that stank of oil and despair, they were herded together. Their uniforms, once a symbol of service, were now little more than tattered rags, gray-green skirts stained with mud, jackets frayed at the cuffs, boots cracked and splitting after months of desperate retreat. Soot smudged their cheeks and clung to their hair. Their faces, some barely out of girlhood, were etched with a profound exhaustion, the legacy of endless, sleepless marches. Their eyes, windows to souls that had witnessed too much, held a confusing mixture of fading youth and a deep, chilling fear. They clutched the last fragments of their former lives, battered suitcases held together with rope, wooden rosaries worn smooth by anxious fingers, half-empty ration tins, pathetic treasures salvaged from a world that no longer existed. A nervous whisper slithered through the ranks as they were shoved toward the waiting boxcars. "The Americans will not spare us," a girl from Hamburg murmured, her voice a tremulous thread of sound. "They will make examples of us. That's what the Luftwaffe officer told me before he—" Her words faded into a choked silence. Another woman, her features hardened by years spent under the harsh glow of searchlights, simply clenched her jaw, her silence louder than any lament. But in that shared silence lay a universal dread. The propaganda had been relentless, a poisonous drip-feed of fear. The Americans were wolves in soldiers' clothing, brutish and uncivilized, men who would strip them of their dignity, humiliate them, and make them regret the very air they breathed. To fall into American hands was a fate painted as worse than a clean, honorable death. And yet, here they were, being forced into the dark, wooden caverns of the same kind of freight wagons that had once carried German troops eastward toward the front with songs on their lips. Now, the journey ran in the opposite direction, away from the corpse of their homeland, deeper into the unknown heart of their defeat. Among them was Anna, a secretary from Munich who had once typed memos in a clean, well-lit office. Now, she hid a small, leather-bound diary in her satchel. As the train shuddered to life, she wrote, her handwriting jagged and leaping with every lurch of the carriage. "We are being taken far away. No one knows our destination. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps, in a way, I will be. We were told the Americans would break our bodies and our spirits. Perhaps they will. The wheels are turning, and with them, our futures." The locomotive groaned, a metal beast awakening. Wheels screeched in protest against the iron rails. Outside their slatted prison, Germany lay in a state of brutalized undress. Bridges, like the broken spines of giants, lay collapsed in rivers. Church steeples were snapped off, pointing accusingly at a leaden sky. Factories stood as skeletal remains, their innards scorched and spilled onto the ground. Thin, persistent smoke still curled from bombed-out neighborhoods, the final breath of a dying era. Along the embankments, children thin as whispers stood and watched, some waving with a strange, automatic curiosity, others simply staring with ancient eyes into the passing cars. Inside, the silence was a physical weight, a thick blanket of fear that clung to every shallow breath. The women huddled together for warmth and solace, their whispers drowned by the relentless metallic rumble of the wheels carrying them westward, away from the ruins of the Reich, and toward a destiny none could yet comprehend. The train pressed on, a rattling serpent of wood and iron winding its way through the corpse of a nation. For the women locked within, time lost its meaning, stretching into a monotonous agony of fear and uncertainty. Daylight, filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls, revealed a panorama of devastation. Mile after relentless mile, the brutal truth of their homeland's defeat unfolded. They saw cities that were no more than jagged skeletons of stone and mortar. Bridges were twisted into surreal, metal sculptures plunged into muddy rivers. Whole villages were blackened scars upon the landscape, their silence more eloquent than any scream. The ruins passed in a grim, silent procession, and each fresh sight was a knife twisting in their guts. They had served this Reich, believed its promises, followed its orders. Now, all they could see were the ashes of those promises, blowing away in the wind. When night fell, the train would often halt on desolate sidings. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the guards' boots on the gravel outside was a constant reminder of their powerlessness. Occasionally, the sharp, distant crack of a gunshot would echo through the darkness, a stark signal that the war's chaos had not yet been fully tamed, even in surrender. Inside the boxcars, the women huddled for warmth, their thin blankets insufficient against the biting cold that seeped through the wooden planks. Their whispers filled the oppressive dark. "They said the Americans would humiliate us," one voice muttered, tight with a dread that was now a constant companion. "They will put us on display like animals in a zoo. Perhaps they will simply starve us," another replied, her fingers clutching a rosary so tightly the beads threatened to imprint on her skin. "A slow, quiet death." "No," a third voice cut in, sharp with a bitter certainty. "They will do worse, far worse. That is what we were told. That is what we must believe." The Reich's propaganda had done its work well, its venom coursing through their veins. For years, they had been fed a steady diet of lies. The Americans were weak, yet capable of immense cruelty. They were decadent, yet ruthlessly efficient in their brutality. Capture meant degradation, mockery, starvation, and fates too dark to be spoken of in polite company. And yet, as the train rumbled through the long nights, small, insidious doubts began to creep into the cracks of their fear. If the Americans were truly the monsters they had been depicted, why had there been a semblance of order at the railway yards? Why had the guards not beaten them, spat on them, or taken their meager possessions? This absence of expected cruelty was deeply unsettling, a calm that felt like the prelude to a storm of unimaginable violence. Anna, her body swaying with the rhythm of the train, wrote by the faint light seeping through the slats. We pass through a land of ghosts. Factories without roofs, churches without steeples, children without shoes or hope. We are told the Americans will strip us of our dignity. Perhaps that is true, but I cannot help but feel that Germany has already done this to us first. Through the gaps, they saw spectral figures scavenging in the rubble, women pushing handcarts filled with splintered furniture for firewood, children with outstretched hands begging soldiers for a crust of bread. The chasm between the Reich's grandiose rhetoric and the stark, starving reality of its people could no longer be ignored. The train, an iron will of its own, carried them ever westward, farther from the world they knew, deeper into a terrifying void of the unknown. After days of this rattling, claustrophobic journey, the train finally screeched to a final hissing halt near the coast. The air changed, carrying the sharp, clean scents of salt and diesel fuel. Beyond the fences of the rail yard, they could see the immense, organized bustle of Allied ports: Bremen, Le Havre, Cherbourg. The shattered world of Germany was abruptly replaced by a strange, intimidating order. The women were marched from the boxcars in long, weary columns. The sound of their worn boots on the wooden planks of the docks echoed, a hollow rhythm against the cacophony of rumbling engines, shouting stevedores, and the crash of waves against pilings. And there, looming before them, were the massive American troop ships. They were gray leviathans, floating fortresses, their decks swarming with activity, their flags snapping smartly in the wind. The women braced themselves. This was it, they thought, the moment of their descent into punishment. They expected jeers, curses, the hard shove of a rifle butt as they were herded up the gangways like cattle to the slaughter. Instead, they were met with paperwork. Beneath faded canvas tarps, American officers sat at field tables, checking names against long lists, stamping documents with a bureaucratic finality, cataloging their pitiful possessions. The process was clipped, efficient, and utterly impersonal. To the women, it felt less like a prelude to vengeance and more like being processed into a vast, indifferent machine. They couldn't decide if this dispassionate order was a form of mercy or a new, more subtle kind of cruelty. When they were finally led onto the ships, the strangeness only deepened. They were not forced into foul, airless holds, but into spaces filled with rows of steel bunks, each equipped with a blanket and a thin mattress. It was stark and metallic, smelling of oil and the sea, but it was not the squalor they had feared. Then came the first, profound shock: the food. On metal trays, they were given food that seemed to belong to a forgotten dream. There was bread, real, white bread, pale and soft and warm. There were thick slices of meat swimming in a rich stew, steaming mugs of coffee that filled the air with its robust aroma, and even pats of real golden butter. Some of the women froze, staring at the trays as if they were a cruel trick. Others trembled, refusing to eat, whispering to each other that it must be poisoned. But the pangs in their stomachs were a more powerful imperative than the fear in their hearts. Slowly, tentatively, they tasted, and then the dam broke. A young woman from Dresden who had survived the firestorm began to weep uncontrollably as the flavor of the warm bread filled her mouth. Another let out a short, nervous laugh as the coffee's warmth spread through her chest, a sensation of comfort she had not felt in years. Anna, her diary hidden beside her, scribbled with a hand shaking from more than the ship's vibration. I taste real bread for the first time in years. It is soft, like a cloud, not the coarse, gritty sawdust we called bread. I do not know whether to weep or to offer a prayer of thanks. Is this kindness, or is it merely another, more sophisticated form of humiliation? Around them, the American guards stood watch. They were calm, their expressions neutral, offering neither mockery nor comfort. Their very indifference was more disarming than any hostility would have been. For the German women, who had survived on ersatz bread and watery turnip soup, this single meal was more than mere sustenance. It was the first, undeniable physical proof that the world they had been told about, a world of American brutality and scarcity, was a lie. As the ship's powerful engines roared to life, carrying them across the Atlantic and away from the ruins of Europe, a new, unsettling realization began to dawn. Their captivity would not be anything like what they had been prepared to endure. The days at sea blurred into a strange, suspended reality. A rhythm of waves, the constant hum of the engines, the echoing steel corridors, and the cautious, regular meals. Seasickness claimed many, but even the misery of nausea could not erase the memory of that first taste of bread, that first sip of real coffee. Still, they braced themselves, steeling their souls for what would happen when the ships finally reached the enemy's shores. Then, one morning, a murmur rippled through the decks, a single word charged with electric intensity: "Land!" Crowding against the railings, the women stared in stunned, utter silence as the outline of America materialized from the morning haze. Whether it was the towering skyline of New York, the historic contours of Boston, or the bustling port of New Orleans, the effect was the same: a profound, soul-shaking disbelief. For those arriving in New York, the sight was beyond comprehension. Skyscrapers pierced the heavens, their windows glittering in the sunlight, utterly untouched by bombs. The Statue of Liberty stood serene and immense in the harbor, her torch held high, a symbol of a meaning they could not yet grasp. To women from Munich, Hamburg, and Cologne, cities reduced to fields of rubble, it was like gazing upon the surface of another planet, a world that had not known the apocalypse. Anna wrote in her diary that day, her words trembling with a mixture of awe and a crushing despair. "We have lost everything. Our cities are dust. And yet, they live here, untouched. Their buildings scrape the sky. Their streets are clean and whole. Their people walk without fear, without looking upward for death. Is this what victory looks like? Or is this simply what the truth looks like, and we have been living a lie?" As the ships were secured in the harbors, crowds gathered on the piers. Some Americans jeered, shouting words in English the women could only half understand. Others simply stared, their curiosity outweighing their hostility. The German prisoners clutched their thin coats tighter, expecting a hail of stones, of spit, of raw hatred. Instead, they were met mostly with a vast, eerie silence, a collective indifference that was, in its own way, more confounding than rage. When they marched ashore under guard, the shock only deepened. The streets smelled of salt and industry, but not of fire and decay. Houses stood intact, their porches painted white, their gardens tidy. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks, their laughter a sound from a different universe. Shop windows overflowed with goods, colorful fruits, new clothes, things they had not seen in half a decade. Every single detail screamed the same, undeniable truth. America was untouched, prosperous, and vibrantly, painfully alive. For women who had walked through streets littered with corpses and the debris of their own homes, the contrast was a physical blow. The Reich had promised them 1,000 years of glory. What they saw here was the Reich's lie, laid bare in the harsh, unassailable light of day. Buses and trains then carried them inland, away from the coasts and deeper into this bewildering landscape of abundance. Through the windows they saw endless fields of green, towns where life continued with a mundane normalcy that felt like a miracle. In their hearts, the German women began to feel the weight of something heavier than any prison chain. Captivity in such a place would be more than just punishment. It would be a relentless, daily revelation. And that revelation had only just begun. The buses eventually rumbled through the gates of internment camps, their wire crowns gleaming in the sun, dust pluming behind the tires. Guard towers stood sentinel. But even here, the order felt different. The fences were straight and tidy, the paths between the barracks were swept clean, the wooden buildings were uniform and freshly painted. This was not the gray, brutalist punishment camp of their imaginations. It was not the nightmarish place whispered about in Germany, and that very difference deepened their sense of unease and disorientation. They were led off the buses, their names called once more from clipboards. American officers moved through the procedures with a detached efficiency, stamping, signing, cataloging. Each prisoner received a numbered tag. Their tattered uniforms were exchanged for plain but clean work clothes. The process was devoid of malice, of insults, of the expected blows. Yet the absence of the cruelty they had been conditioned to expect was, in itself, a form of psychological torture. Then came the moment they had been silently dreading. The guards gestured toward a low, utilitarian building from which plumes of steam hissed into the air. Inside, the floor was tiled. The pipes rattled. The air was warm and thick with moisture. The women stiffened, their bodies tensing. This, they whispered to one another, their voices hushed with terror, must be the place of their humiliation. The rumors flew between them in frantic, hissed syllables. They will strip us naked. They will laugh at us. They will... One woman clutched her small, salvaged suitcase to her chest as if it were a shield. Another crossed herself, her lips moving in silent prayer. The line moved forward with agonizing slowness, each heartbeat a thunderous drum in their ears. And then, the first woman stepped inside, and reality collided with their grim expectations. Into their hands were placed bars of soap, real soap. It was thick, heavy, and white, exuding a faint, clean fragrance of flowers. Then came towels, coarse but clean, and fresh garments, folded neatly. And then, as the taps were turned, a miracle occurred. Hot water, real, steaming hot water, poured down in steady, generous streams from showerheads above. The shock was visceral, overwhelming. For years, they had lived in a layer of grime, their hair matted and louse-ridden, their skin caked with the soot of burning cities and the sweat of fear. Now, this cascade of hot water washed it all away. Some women laughed, a nervous, giddy sound of disbelief. Others wept openly, their sobs echoing in the tiled room, the grime on their faces mixing with clean tears and washing down the drain. They rubbed the fragrant soap over their arms, their faces, into their hair, scrubbing away not just the dirt, but the outer layer of their old lives. Anna, clutching her diary later in the barracks, wrote with a hand that was still trembling. We were prepared for blows, for whips, for cold. Instead, they gave us soap. How is one to understand this? I feel clean for the first time in years. My scalp no longer crawls with lice. My skin no longer burns with filth. They treat us not as beasts to be broken, but as human women. What kind of enemy does this? The transformation in that steamy, tiled room was not merely physical. It was a profound psychological upheaval. The Reich had conditioned them for cruelty. Their enemy, in a single, simple act, had offered them restoration, and that contradiction wounded them more deeply than any overt hatred ever could. That night, lying in their bunks with damp, clean hair spread out on starched pillows, the women whispered to one another in the dark, as if sharing a dangerous and fragile secret. Perhaps they are not what we were told. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Perhaps the entire war had concealed a truth far more difficult to accept, that kindness in this context could be more unbearable than cruelty. The morning after the showers, the women were marched into a long mess hall. The air was thick with smells that triggered deep, almost forgotten memories. The rich scent of coffee, the yeasty warmth of baking bread, the sizzle of meat and grease. They halted at the doorway, disoriented and suspicious. Before them stretched rows of tables, and behind a serving counter, immense pots simmered. There was beef stew, thick with chunks of meat and potatoes. There were fresh rolls, their tops glistening with melted butter. There were mounds of cooked carrots and peas and great steaming urns of that dark, plentiful coffee. It was an assault of abundance, an overwhelming spectacle of plenty. They moved forward cautiously, their movements hesitant. Cooks in white aprons, their faces impersonal, ladled stew into tin plates, slid bread across the counter, poured coffee into mugs. Some women took their trays as if they were handling something dangerous, afraid it might be snatched away or revealed as a mirage. Anna sat down, staring at the portion before her. A generous serving of stew with glistening globules of fat floating on the surface. A roll that was still warm to the touch. A mug of coffee that steamed in her hands. She hesitated, then slowly dipped her spoon into the broth and brought it to her lips. The taste undid her. For years, her meals had been a study in deprivation. Black bread cut with sawdust, thin turnip soup that was little more than flavored water, an occasional scrap of horse meat on a lucky day. Now, in the heart of the enemy's camp, she held on her tray more nourishment than she had consumed in weeks. Around her, other women were similarly overcome. One began to weep silently, her spoon clattering onto the tray. Another whispered, her voice cracking, "My brothers froze and starved in Russia. For this. And here, they feed us like kings." It was not just about the food. It was the devastating contradiction. The Reich had told them they would be starved and broken. Instead, the Americans placed heaping plates of stew before them, They had prepared their spirits for cruelty, for a test of endurance. But this quiet, civil provision of sustenance was far more disturbing to their worldview. Anna's diary entry that evening was stark. To be hungry was a state of being we understood. It made a terrible sense. But to be fed by the enemy, to be nourished by his hand, this is infinitely harder. I do not know how to swallow this food without also swallowing my shame. The American guards patrolled the aisles, their faces neutral, their demeanor professional. One young soldier, whose face was still soft with youth, offered a faint, almost shy smile as he passed Anna's table, a fleeting gesture that seemed to say, "It's all right. You are safe here." The prisoners quickly lowered their eyes, ashamed to feel a flicker of comfort from a source they had been taught to despise. The meal ended in a heavy silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the clatter of trays being collected. Yet, in that silence, something fundamental had shifted. The women no longer feared being destroyed by brutality. They were beginning to fear being utterly undone by a kindness they could not comprehend. Life in the camp soon settled into a strange, structured routine. A bell rang each morning, signaling the start of the day. They lined up for breakfast, eggs, porridge, sometimes even strips of bacon. Afterward, they were assigned to light duties, working in the laundry, assisting in the kitchens, mending uniforms, or tending to the camp's small vegetable gardens. It was monotonous, regulated, and almost ordinary. For women who had prepared themselves for a daily struggle against cruelty, this mundane regularity was profoundly unsettling. There were no arbitrary punishments, no mocking jeers, no deliberate deprivation, only the quiet, efficient machinery of being managed, cataloged, and contained. At night, they lay in their wooden bunks, their hair clean from the showers, their stomachs full, yet a deep restlessness lingered. They could not reconcile this reality with the one they had been conditioned to expect. Then came the next profound shock: the canteen. Each woman received a small wage in camp script, initially 80 cents a day, later raised to $1. With this strange play money currency, they were permitted to enter the post exchange, the camp store. Inside, the shelves were stocked with goods that belonged to a life they had almost forgotten. There were chocolate bars in shiny colored wrappers, packs of cigarettes, pencils and notebooks, jars of jam and preserves, and, most astonishingly, tubes of lipstick. The women halted at the entrance, staring as if they were before a sacred altar. A Hershey's bar gleamed in its silver foil. A pack of Lucky Strikes promised the familiar comfort of tobacco. The lipsticks stood in a row, their hues of red and pink evoking memories of girlhood dances and a world before the war. The irony of the situation was almost cruel. Anna's hand trembled as she picked up a bar of chocolate. When she broke off a piece and let it melt on her tongue, the intense alien sweetness brought sudden, unbidden tears to her eyes. She turned away quickly, ashamed of the pleasure it gave her. A girl from Bremen, her hands shaking, carefully applied a bold red lipstick and then gasped at her reflection in a small mirror. I feel human again," she whispered as if confessing a terrible sin. But this rediscovery of small luxuries came with a heavy price: guilt. While they were buying chocolate, their families back home were scavenging in ruins for scraps of food. While they smoothed lipstick onto their lips, their mothers were digging in the cold earth for coal. "The enemy sells us lipstick," one woman murmured, her voice thick with a bitter irony. "What kind of bizarre, upside-down world is this?" Anna recorded the turmoil in her diary. "I buy chocolate with the enemy's money. I taste sugar on my tongue while the children in Munich starve. I hold a tube of lipstick while my mother digs for bits of coal in the rubble. Each sweet, delicious bite feels like a betrayal. It cuts deeper than any hunger pang ever did." The camp canteen revealed more than just American abundance. It revealed the complete inversion of their entire belief system. Their homeland, to which they had pledged their loyalty, had left them with nothing but rubble and hunger. Their enemies, sworn to destroy them, were giving them back fragments of their humanity, their individuality, their femininity. And that, they were discovering, was a burden far harder to bear than any physical chain. In the quiet evenings, after the day's work was done and the camp grew still, the most potent torment did not come from the barbed wire or the watchtowers. It came in the form of mail. Letters, thin and fragile, trickled in from Germany. They were censored and delayed, but they carried the unmistakable scent of a lost world, a faint odor of ash, of candle wax, of damp cellars. The women would gather around rough-hewn tables, carefully unfolding these precious envelopes, their eyes darting across the cramped, desperate handwriting that carried more weight than any prison sentence. One woman read a line from her mother aloud, her voice catching in her throat. "We live in the cellar now. The house above is gone, just a pile of stones. We boil dandelion greens and nettles for soup. Your brother coughs, and there is blood on his handkerchief. If you have anything at all, please send it." She could not continue. Another letter spoke of children with no shoes, their feet wrapped in rags during the snow, of fathers who had simply disappeared into the chaos, of neighbors buried when their apartment block collapsed. The women held these letters, these fragile pieces of paper, knowing they could send nothing back but hollow words of reassurance. Food could not cross the ocean. Chocolate could not be wrapped and mailed. The soap, the stew, the clean beds. Their families would never know such things. This chasm, this impossible gulf between their relative comfort and their homeland's absolute misery, was a pain sharper than any physical deprivation. Anna wrote that night, her words stark on the page. "My stomach is full, but my heart is a hollow, aching thing. Every bite of bread I take here feels like a theft from my mother's mouth. I cannot look at the food on my tray without seeing her hands, thin and shaking from cold and hunger." Some tried to write back with forced optimism, describing the orderly routine, the work, the cleanliness, but a profound guilt seeped into every sentence. "We are safe here," one woman wrote before penning and adding, "but at what cost? To be well fed in this place while my father starves in the ruins. It is a burden heavier than any chain I have ever worn." The contrast was simply unbearable. At home, Germany was a vast graveyard of cities. Here, in the land of the enemy, they were fed, clothed, and kept clean. The Reich had promised them honor and strength, and had delivered only ruin and starvation. The Americans, whom they had been taught to see as degraders, had given them hot showers, fresh clothes, and soap. It was a complete inversion of the moral universe they had believed in, and it gnawed at the very foundations of their souls. A few women, desperate to bridge this chasm of guilt, would pool their small camp wages. They would buy chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes from the canteen, carefully packing them into parcels marked for the Red Cross, a faint, desperate hope that something might get through. It was a tiny, defiant act against their powerlessness, a gesture to alleviate the shame of their own survival. But in their hearts, they knew most of these parcels would be lost, delayed, or confiscated. They were left only with the shame, their diaries filled with anguish, and the crushing knowledge that their very survival had become a source of profound pain. Day by day, week by week, the relentless routine of civility continued to erode the fortress of propaganda the Reich had built inside their minds. They had arrived expecting to confront wolves. Instead, they found a bureaucracy of order, nourishment, and a disconcerting civility that unsettled them more deeply than any cruelty. It was the small, human moments that struck the deepest chords. In December, the camp mess hall hosted a modest Christmas gathering. The guards had pinned paper stars to the walls and played carols over a crackling loudspeaker. When Stille Nacht began, Silent Night in English, a few of the German women instinctively began to hum, then to sing. First in whispers, then with clearer voices, the melody, universal and haunting, filled the room. For a brief, surreal moment, guards and prisoners sang the same carol together, the familiar tune a bridge across the chasm of war. Anna recorded the event with a sense of wonder. "We were told these men were beasts, incapable of sentiment or faith. Yet tonight they sang Silent Night with us. This kindness, this shared moment of peace, wounds me more deeply than any hatred. Hatred is simple. It fortifies the walls inside you. But kindness breaks them down, brick by brick. Even brief, casual encounters with the guards widened the cracks in their preconceptions. One young American, noticing Anna looking at a photograph he had tucked in his pocket, pulled it out. It showed a smiling, fresh-faced young woman. "My sister," he said with a simple shrug, "back in Kansas. She's about your age, I guess." Then he walked on. That casual, almost brotherly remark lingered. If he had a sister like them, and he was like a brother to her, then how could he be the monster from the posters and the radio broadcasts? Even the simplest, most mundane things became betrayers of the Reich's lies. A bar of chocolate bought with camp script, a guard lending a pencil without a second thought, a shared, weary smile about the quality of the camp coffee. These tiny, insignificant acts carried an immense weight. Each one was a chip hammered away from the monolithic narrative of American savagery. Of course, suspicion did not vanish overnight. A handful of women clung stubbornly to the old hatred, muttering that the Americans' generosity was a facade, a clever trap to lull them into a false sense of security before the real punishment began. But as the months of captivity stretched into a year, it became increasingly difficult to maintain that illusion. The Americans did not strip them of their dignity. They did not starve them. They did not work them to death. Instead, they allowed them to regain their weight, their health, the color in their cheeks, and even, tentatively, their laughter. The comparison became impossible to ignore. The Reich, to which they had pledged their loyalty, had rewarded that loyalty with hunger, ruins, and lies. The enemy, whose stated goal was their defeat, was giving them soap, bread, medicine, and a structured order. It was a devastating equation. By the spring of 1946, the whispers among the women carried a dangerous, unthinkable admission. We were deceived. The words were spoken softly in the dark, but they were spoken nonetheless. Anna wrote one line that captured the slow, inexorable collapse of an entire worldview. If they are human, with sisters and mothers and a capacity for kindness, then what does that make us? What does that make of everything we were told, everything we believed, everything we did? The war had ended on the battlefield, but the real, more profound conflict had only just begun for them. It was a battle fought not with rifles or bombs, but within the deepest chambers of their own hearts. A battle between memory and reality, between ingrained loyalty and the undeniable, merciless truth. And the truth was this: the Reich had lied about everything. By the summer of 1946, the physical transformation of the women was undeniable. The faces that had arrived in the camps, gaunt, hollowed out by hunger and fear, now had filled out, their skin touched with color from hours of work in the sun. Hair that had been brittle and lank now shone with health. Bodies that had been wasted by years of rationing were now strong and capable again. They looked, in many ways, like the young women they had been before the war, except for their eyes. Their eyes held a knowledge that belied their restored youth. Anna often caught her reflection in the polished surface of a wash basin in the camp laundry. "I look younger," she wrote. "My cheeks are round. The shadows are gone from under my eyes. But I feel a century older. Each day of health granted by this strange captivity feels like a weight added to my soul. To be healed by the hand of the enemy is a paradox that haunts my every waking moment. This paradox tormented many of them. To have been brutalized would have been almost reassuring, a confirmation that the world was as the Reich had described it, a validation of their sacrifice and their fear. But to be restored, to be treated with a basic, impersonal civility, was a wound to their very identity. It forced a reckoning they were not prepared to make. The letters from home, when they came, only deepened this internal conflict. The reports of continued hunger, of families still living in damp cellars, of the relentless, grinding struggle for survival in the ruins, created a stark, unbearable contrast with the abundance of their American captivity. In the dark of the barracks, some women began to whisper confessions they would never dare commit to paper. "I am afraid to go back. I am more terrified of returning to that starvation and ruin than I was of coming here." As the prospect of repatriation drew nearer, this dread grew into a heavy, shared anxiety. To return to Germany meant stepping back into a world of scarcity, judgment, and painful memories. How would their families receive them? With their fuller cheeks, their healthy hair, their bodies that spoke of regular meals? Would they be resented for having survived too well? Would their stories of soap and chocolate be seen as a betrayal? Anna gave voice to this collective, unspoken fear. We arrived here expecting blows, chains, and degradation. Instead, we will leave carrying burdens far heavier than any chain. How do we go home? How do we look into the eyes of our starving mothers, with the scent of American soap still on our skin? The women understood now that their captivity would not last forever. On a crisp morning, names began to be read from new lists for transport back to Germany. As each woman stepped forward to begin the journey east, the full magnitude of what had happened was clear. The Reich had collapsed, not just as a political and military entity, but as a system of belief. Every bar of chocolate, every hot shower, every clean towel, every glimpse of an untouched American town, and every neutral-faced guard had combined to shatter the myth of Nazi righteousness and American barbarism. They were leaving America profoundly changed, not in their core identity as Germans, nor in a sudden blind loyalty to their former captors, but in the deeper, more unsettling knowledge that they had been lied to on a monumental scale. They had been betrayed by a regime that promised glory and a place in history, and had delivered only hunger, ashes, and a legacy of shame. Anna closed the final entry in her diary with words that would echo long after the camp gates had closed behind them for the last time. "We arrived as the enemy, frightened and defiant, our hearts armored with lies. We leave as women who have seen a mirror held up to those lies and watched them crack and fall away. We leave having been shown a terrible, clarifying truth. And for many of us, that truth, the truth of soap, of food, of dignity given by the enemy, will be more haunting and more lasting than any memory of the battlefield."